Welcome to Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last, but certainly not least, all of you that desperately cling to your confirmation bias. Whether your interest is Atlantis, Zeus, or anything in between, we tackle it all from our quantumly entangled castle, tucked away in the ancient flood-battered Central Pangaean mountain range. We're a podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient, mysterious, and unknown with logic and reason, and where we also theorize the fourth dimension exists as the spiritual. I'm going to put in some additional trigger warnings here. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the topic we're going to be talking about tonight, so there's going to be some extra, more adult references in there, and I don't want to have to censor the story to tell the story, even though this is going to be a summary. So viewer discretion is advised. I'd say teen or later on. But aside that, the only other trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation. So if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, you'll want to turn off the podcast now. So welcome back, everyone. We are finally, after 32 episodes, shifting over to talk about other mythology besides the Bible. That being said, I'm here with my beautiful wife, Madison, once again.
Hello, hello.
So you've got a psychology fact for us that relates to this episode, so go ahead and share what you got.
Kind of relates to it, but pretty much. So, trying to pull up my notes. So precognitive dreams are dreams that seem to predict the future, but there's little scientific evidence to support it. And a lot of scientists chalk it up to coincidence or the law of large numbers. Yeah.
Basically saying that statistical probability that you're going to dream something that comes true at some point in your life, right? That's kind of the gist of the law of numbers or whatever you just said.
Yeah. So the more you dream, basically the more you dream, the more of a chance you have of reality aligning with your dreams. And that's kind of their explanation for it, which I personally don't believe in that.
Yeah, that sounds like a cop-out to me, but...
Well, I just don't believe in coincidence in general, but definitely for this, I feel like it's more to do with the brain's ability for intuitive thinking and yeah. So that's where I'm at with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that there can be predictive thought processes involved in dreaming, but I think to say that all dreams that predict the future, because there was one case that you read where one girl had a dream of a doctor. Oh, are you going to say that? You can go ahead.
Yeah, I have it. Don't spoil it.
Whoops. I didn't realize. I thought you had closed out of the tab. Go ahead.
No, I have all of my tabs open, just like my brain. So basically, this person online said that they dreamed about their sister having issues with her head and talking to a doctor, and the doctor said that she would pass away. So this woman that dreamed that, she woke up and she called her sister immediately. And the sister kind of laughed it off and was like, that's funny, haha. 10 days later, she passed away from a brain hemorrhage. Mm-hmm. And for me, I don't think that, I don't believe in coincidence. And for that to happen 10 days apart, that's kind of crazy.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think there are instances where the brain may just predict certain things, but I think that there's also a lot of instances where there's something more going on than we've been able to quantify with our science, which is what this show is all about. But I feel like I could talk about this all night, and that's not the theme of the episode. You're going to be coming on in a month or so talking to us about dreams.
Heck yeah.
So we'll save this conversation of precognition for that.
There will also be discussion about lucid dreaming, which is also very fun.
Yes, I'm
have very excited for that.
I have my own thoughts and comments, and the listeners are aware because they probably listened to episode 27 with computers, AI, and all that, where we talked about how consciousness would integrate. And so there was some, Isaiah and I kind of went down the rabbit hole of consciousness a little bit there. So and you're doing an episode on consciousness as well, I think, or something like that.
I'm going to try to connect the two, I think.
Yeah. So some fun psychology ones coming up, but we are finally progressing into our mythology study. Finally. Woo-hoo. We are going to be hitting on Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, it's a pretty big historical document and find. It's like the oldest story that we have record of. I'll hit all the dates and everything here, but it's really important for looking at comparative mythology because it goes back to ancient Sumerian times, and that gives connections to a lot of other civilizations in that area there, because Sumeria was around the region, well, specifically Mesopotamia is kind of the broader name of the region, but it's the Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran area. It's like the Fertile Crescent. It's like most of that. Mesopotamia is like the official name of the land. The Sumerian is the culture that lived there that this story is coming from. So the Sumerian period, you kind of get a hodgepodge of dates depending on what you look up and where you go to. I just hopped on the Encyclopedia Britannica for this. You're looking around 3300 BCE to around 2500 BCE for the Sumerian period, and maybe a little bit older even, depending on how those exact dates break down. So our first document, it's the first documented culture that we have record of, like actually existing, and then archaeological finds to back it up, because as listeners are aware, I'm a fan of Atlantis existing, but there's no archaeological finds to prove that at this time. So first cities of Uruk, the city of Ur, cuneiform writing is developed by the Sumerians, or maybe even a precursor civilization, we don't know, but it's around during the time of the Sumerians. The Sumerians are then succeeded by the Akkadian Empire and then the Babylonian period after that. So that kind of takes you all the way up to around 2000 BCE. So that's about 4,500 years ago for our listeners. Quick maths on the spot. So the
Better you than me.
Yeah. So you'll see some connections here if you're familiar with the biblical texts at all. The city of Ur, I believe, is where Abraham, or formerly known as Abram, comes from, the father of the whole Jewish tribe. Babylon is also mentioned a lot in the Bible in, like, I think it's like 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Kings. The exile with like the book of Daniel, Esther. I believe Xerxes was Babylonian. I could be wrong on that. He might have been that, or Assyrian. Might have been Assyrian. Anyway, one of those. It's around that time period. Are you going to fact check me on that?
I might. Yeah.
Thank you. And then the Xerxes, actually from the book of Esther, is the one that showed down against Leonidas, the Spartans, the 300 movie. For those of you that have seen that.
I love that movie.
Yeah. So the guy that's depicted. Oh, it was Persian. Thank you.
He's
okay.
Persian.
Yeah, so there's a huge succession of empires that followed all within the span of Daniel the prophet's lifetime in the Bible. It was Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, and then I think there was something else after that. But that carries you more into like 1000 AD and, or 1000 BC, and closer to the AD mark. Babylon had a cultural center, so they were really big into their predecessor cultures as well. So studying Akkadian and Sumerian mythology and integrating it into their culture. Various achievements from these cultures here is they had a lot of urbanization. You have early city-states evolving with Uruk and Ur, ziggurats being constructed, which are like a form of step pyramids.
Yeah.
Cuneiform writing, record keeping, those are all huge. Legal systems, Hammurabi's Code, which is the first documented law code of justice that we have, was developed by the Babylonians around that 2000 BCE time period. And then a lot of trade and economy as well, developments, early currency, trade networks, things like that. So there's a little bit of background on, kind of where the Epic of Gilgamesh comes from as a story. So let's see here. Do you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I'm just trying to think about the Hammurabi Code, because I know I learned about it a little bit in high school, but I very briefly touched on it.
Yeah, and I know I'm throwing a lot of information at the listeners. I do apologize for that. I'm just kind of trying to give you a little bit of a flavor of where this is coming from and how we have records of this. The Epic of Gilgamesh is originally a Sumerian story, but we do have copies of it from Babylonian texts as well. There's different, as a result of that, there's a lot of different variations of it. So you had like schoolboys would copy this down as they're learning cuneiform writing and the other forms of writing, and like Babylonian, I think, as well. So there would be different variations of the epic. So it's not one consistent story. So like with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? We can go back and we can see there's like 99% accuracy with what the Dead Sea Scrolls say versus what our modern Bible transcripts say. And that 1% of error is like it says the Lord God or Lord God or something like that. Something very small that doesn't change the meaning. Epic of Gilgamesh, different story. It's more kind of all over the place because it was copied down. It was embellished at certain points. So this is a text that we know because of all the variations that exist, that it's been embellished. So we can't know for sure every single detail of what is actually true. But many historians do believe that Gilgamesh was indeed a true historic figure. Of course, we don't know exactly when he would have lived. The assumption is that, some point in the Sumerian time or even a little bit before. Let's see here. Anything else? One other thing I'll hit on real quick here. Some historians do believe that the Epic of Gilgamesh influenced Greek stories such as the Odyssey. And that'll be an interesting comparative myth point I want to circle back to when we study Greek mythology, just to compare those two. Because they also say the same thing about the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1 and 2. And you read those two accounts and it's like, there's not really, which we'll talk about the Enuma Elish. It's the 7 tablets of creation from Babylonian tradition. But we'll talk about that in a future episode. That's upcoming. I'm prepping all of that content now. So it's like I've already kind of cycled out Gilgamesh out of my mind and I'm like focused on that. So I might have an airhead moment where I say something that's slightly factually wrong here, but hopefully you'll catch me.
You'll do your best.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Hey, we get 80% of our facts wrong 90% of the time on this show. Let's...
Heck yeah.
All right.
We're actually going to fact check something later.
Yes, we're going to do a correction at the end of the episode, but save that stuff for the end.
Yes.
So
look forward to that.
A little bit about the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, and then we'll take a break after I get over all this recap. We'll just get all the recap out of the way of like the history of the Epic of Gilgamesh, why it's important, where it's coming from, and then do our first ad break, and then we'll come back strong, and I'll give you my retelling of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it was written in cuneiform on clay tablets around 2100 BCE. So, quick math. Yeah, it's like over 4,000 years ago for our listeners. It's a very long time. I already hit a lot of this stuff. Part of the Mesopotamian mythology, trickling down from Sumer through the Akkadian into Babylonian. The tablets were rediscovered in Nineveh. Actually, there's a library in Nineveh that they were discovered from. And listeners that are familiar with the biblical texts are probably familiar with Jonah, the story of Jonah. He went to Nineveh. So there's another connection to the region as well. You gave me a weird look. Is everything all right?
I just have something pulled up. It says, I don't know. It says it was discovered in 1901 in the ruins of Elamite city of Susa. So would that be...
that might have been a different copy of it. I don't know. We'll take a look at that on the ad break here and figure out which one. But there was a tablet, at least, of Gilgamesh discovered in Nineveh, although it might not have been the most recent one. One of the oldest known works of literature. I'm also going to hit a point here. Lapis lazuli is referenced a lot in the story here, and that's a rock that's kind of got a bluish gold tint to it, and it's very common in the regions. Last thing I'll hit here is Gilgamesh is known sometimes as Bilgames as well, depending on the translation. That being said, we're going to take an ad break. We're going to fact check me here real quick.
I already have it pulled up.
Okay. I'll take a look at it as well, see where I got that from in all my notes.
Yep.
And then we'll come back. We're going to do a quick character list to familiarize you as the listener with some key figures, and then we're going to jump into the story. So stay tuned for Gilgamesh, an epic retelling. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, we took a look at the facts a little bit more. So I was correct that the Epic of Gilgamesh was first recovered in Nineveh, which is in modern-day Iraq, in 1853.
Somewhere around
Yes,
there.
1853, and then was gradually translated over time, as that was the initial find was in Akkadian. And then the findings in Susa you were talking about was in 1901.
Yeah.
And those were in Babylonian. And so the Epic of Gilgamesh itself is incomplete in certain sections because the tablets have fragmented. So we've had the initial finding in 1853 that we were then able to supplement with the Babylonian translations found in 1901. And there's even been recent findings up until I think the last 10 years or even less of the Epic of Gilgamesh, of fragments of it that have helped fill in aspects to the story. One of which I'll hit on and actually highlight because I did find an article talking about a recent discovery. So that clears that up. I was correct that was the first finding, but you also had a good point, as that was an important development to augment and really flush out the story for us.
And I even found like other sources that said that they were found in other places too, like Assur, Borsippa. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing those right. Hopefully people understand what I mean.
Yeah.
Anywho.
That being said, we'll just roll onto the character list here. We've got enough historical context there for you all's listeners. If you're not asleep, wake up a little bit more. We're about to roll into the highlights here. So Gilgamesh, he's the main protagonist. He's the king of Uruk. He's often referred to as 2/3 god and 1/3 man. Powerful tyrannical ruler. Then he goes on a journey. Enkidu is a wild man. He's created by the gods to challenge Gilgamesh's arrogance. And then you'll see where that goes. Shamat is another key character in this story. She is a prostitute, and we'll talk a little bit more about her. Let's see who else is worth mentioning here. Mbaba or Mvava, depending on how you want to translate it and read it. He's a monster who is referred to as having horns, and he's a guardian of the cedar or pine forest, depending on how you want to translate it. Ishtar is the goddess of love and war. And then there's a couple other deities here. So you have... I'm trying to figure out which one's the most relevant. Anu is the sky god and father of Ishtar. He's on a divine council. And then you have Enlil, who causes the flood in Sumerian mythology. And then you have Ea, who is the god of wisdom and water. And he helps Utnapishtim survive. I'm skimming over it. There's like 14 characters I had written down. I think that was only like 5 or 7 of them. I'll try to fill in the gaps as we go here. So,
it's like my ADHD brain cannot handle it.
Well, this is perfect though, because you have ADHD, so you can kind of like, pop in and ask questions whenever you need to help the listeners stay on base here and, make sure that they don't get confused. Because I'm familiar with all these names. You're familiar with none of them. So it's a good balance, where if you have a question, pop in and ask.
I'm going in blind with this story. So
Yeah.
I just know very little details about it. But
Gilgamesh, you remember who he is?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So Gilgamesh, he's the king of Uruk. So he's described as 2/3 god, 1/3 man. So he has like that quote unquote divine right to rule. He starts out as being very tyrannical, arrogant, oppressive, selfish ruler. The text would regularly say that he would take women for himself as he pleased, and it would also use the same type of phraseology, at least in the translations, to refer to the men. So it's kind of unclear as to whether it was talking more homosexual or if he was talking about like taking them and fighting them to hone his warrior skill. That's kind of up in the air.
So either he was getting around or he was fighting.
Yeah, one of the two, at least with the men. The women, I think it's a bit more inferred. Okay. So Uruk was a very beautiful city, a very powerful city. It had great walls, it had temples, likely the ziggurats at this point. But the people aren't happy because Gilgamesh is abusing his power. He's doing what he wants. He's sleeping around with whoever he wants. And
or fighting whoever he wants.
And so they cry out to the gods and they're, like, deliver us from this evil person, please. And so the gods actually respond and they create Enkidu to help keep Gilgamesh in check as a counterpart.
So they created him.
They do create him. I believe it says... I forget the goddess's name. It begins with an A. But they create him from like the clay or dirt. So kind of similar to how you see Adam created in the Genesis account. So Enkidu gets created, but initially he's created as a wild man. He's running around the woods with the animals, unable to speak, uncivilized, very hairy, very stocky. But around this time, Gilgamesh starts having a series of dreams about what's coming. He has a dream about like a star falling to the ground that has incredible power. An axe falls to the ground that he can't lift. And so he goes to his mother, who is, I believe, the goddess Ninsun, and he says to her, "Hey, I'm having all these weird dreams. What's this about?" And
I'm having precognitive dreams.
and that's why I had you do that one, because it's a great tie-in. And she's like, "You're gonna have a friend come to you that's like a brother, that's your equal, that's your match." And so he's like, "All right, cool, whatever." But I think you had something you were wanting to ask. I saw you looking up something. And
Oh, the goddess that created Enkidu?
yeah.
Let me look here. Aruru?
Yeah, that's
Aruru?
it. Thank you.
I don't know how to pronounce
Yes,
it.
no, I have it here actually. Yeah, Aruru.
Aruru.
Yes, Enkidu is made from clay by the goddess Aruru, who is the goddess of creation. So yeah, he's a wild man running around in the steppes, probably naked.
We can infer that from Wild Man.
Yes, that's fair enough. So
Think Bigfoot.
yeah, and then you kind of start wondering about those parallels too. But Enkidu is spotted, I think, by it's like a shepherd or a trapper, depending on the version that you read. And Enkidu is dismantling the traps that this person has set out. And so this person, sees him, and they're terrified of Enkidu. They're like, "What the heck is this guy?" So they go off to Gilgamesh, and they plead the case before him, and they're like, "Hey, there's this wild man running around. We don't know what to do with him. He's dismantling all of our traps. He's disrupting society, our society." And Gilgamesh is like, "Okay, so I have a solution for you. I'm going to give you a temple prostitute named Shamhat, and she's going to go out and she's going to seduce Enkidu, and she's going to civilize him." And so she goes out, and it works. And this is why I had younger ears tune out, one of many reasons, because she's a prostitute. But the text does say that they go on to make love for a whole week.
Get it.
So, but in this process, Enkidu is also introduced to like bread and beer and all of these other things that he hasn't seen before from civilization. And he forms a connection with human society and starts getting civilized after all of this. But in this process, he is quote unquote tamed by this woman in a sense, and he loses his connection with nature. So it describes that once before he was able to run with the beasts in the wild and keep up with them, and that after, being with Shamhat, he wasn't able to do it anymore. He lost the animals were afraid of him, and he just couldn't keep up. So it kind of severed him from nature, and so he then goes back to Shamhat and kind of like sits at her feet and learns about everything. And he hears about Gilgamesh and who Gilgamesh is, learns about his tyranny, what all he's doing, learns about life, civilization, and Enkidu isn't happy with what he hears about Gilgamesh. He's very unsatisfied, and he decides that he wants to go and challenge Gilgamesh. So he shows up to Uruk, and one of the texts at least, literally says that Gilgamesh is on his way to go take a bride. A bride that had just been married. So clarify the context there. And Enkidu steps in to the scene, and he blocks Gilgamesh in the doorway, basically. And Gilgamesh tells him to move. He says, "Nope." And they fight. And so they're wrestling. It's like thundering, all throughout the city because these two are fighting. And it's a fierce battle. But it ends with, Gilgamesh kind of gets to a certain point where he realizes he's not going to be able to beat Enkidu. And he's like, "All right, you've proved my equal. You've earned my respect," kind of a thing. And they decide to be kind of become best bros after that.
They're pals.
Yeah. It describes Enkidu as being shorter yet broader. So shorter, but more muscular kind of thing.
Kind of like your friend Kyle.
Yes.
Sorry, Kyle, if you're listening.
College, I had a roommate who was 5'2", and I'm 6'4", so that's who Maddie is referring to here. But yeah, so they bond together. They form a brotherhood, if you will. And then here's another cultural note thing that I'm not sure on, is that it emphasizes that Gilgamesh and Enkidu kiss. And this begs the question of what kind of relationship they're having here, because you have things like French culture where kisses on the cheeks or even kisses on the lips can be a form of greeting that's purely platonic.
Right.
So I'm not trying to read something in here that's not, but I also want to be honest to what the text says. And I was reading this and I was very thoroughly confused as to which one it was. So I just want to present the evidence for the listeners to decide what they think is the most accurate account.
I think it's still up for interpretation anyways, so it's...
Yeah, it's not like we can know about something 4,000 years ago like that.
Just about a kiss.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
So Gilgamesh and Enkidu, become buds and start chilling out in Uruk together. And Enkidu starts just getting depressed. He's like, man, what am I doing here? What am I doing with my life kind of thing? And Gilgamesh is like, you know what? Let's go make a name for ourselves. Let's go and fight Humbaba in the cedar forest. He's the guardian of this divine cedar forest. He's in possession of the flood weapon. Let's go take him out as this monster and conquer him, and we'll make a name for ourselves that way. And so they go to the elders to convene with them to get their advice, and the elders are like, it's probably not such a good idea. And Enkidu is kind of like, yeah, I'm not really sure, Gilgamesh. When I was in my wanderings in the wilderness, I saw Humbaba. I'm not sure if that's the greatest idea. He's a very formidable opponent. And Gilgamesh is just like, screw y'all, we're going anyway. Like, I really don't care what you think. So they forge some high-speed weaponry and set out on their journey. And then this is where the snippet of a recent textual find, and I'll put that link in the show notes for our listeners that are nerdy about mythology like that. But the cedar forest is actually described as being loud, has monkeys, cicadas, and birds, a lot of forest ambiance going on to it. And that was a recent addition to the text we didn't have. But on their journey, Gilgamesh has a series of dreams before the fight. It actually says they go out of their way to make what's called dream huts, and that they would kind of like invoke the spirit of the mountain to come to them and give them a vision of this conflict that was to come. And
so they were basically asking for precognitive dreams.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. And then it would happen. And Gilgamesh would have these dreams and be horrified by them. And then Enkidu would listen and he would interpret the dreams. Mm-hmm. And he'd be like, hey, this is a good sign. This means we're going to actually win the fight and everything. So
I love a good dream interpretation.
Yeah. And so it happens 3 or 4 times where, Gilgamesh has these things and he's like, they're nightmares. And Enkidu's like, no, we're going to win. We're good. We're good, bro. It establishes their the importance of their teamwork and the bond that they're building together here on this journey. So, the battle with Humbaba. So they sneak up on him. They kind of surprise him a little bit. It's referenced in the text that he has on only one of his 7 cloaks. I don't know what exactly that means, if it's referring to more armor or if it's referring to some type of weaponry or something else. But Humbaba sees him, and they kind of have a little bit of banter. He calls Enkidu a traitor, because he's also seen Enkidu before. They've kind of interacted a tiny bit. Mm-hmm. And they get into a fierce fight. And then the sun god, Shamash, intervenes. I believe it's with several of the winds of the world that help pin Humbaba down. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu get the upper hand, and they have Humbaba. He's still alive, but he's begging for mercy. He begs for his life. Enkidu encourages Gilgamesh to just kill him. And then Humbaba starts to, curse the pair of heroes. He says, you're not going to grow old together. And Gilgamesh gets furious at this and slits his throat. So,
dang.
Goodbye, Humbaba. Yeah. They then level the whole cedar forest. They chop all the trees down. I believe they send Humbaba's head down the river as well. As kind of like a flaunt of victory, if you will.
Like for anyone to see.
Yeah. And then Enkidu starts getting worried about them having turned the forest into a wasteland. He's like, hey, this is probably going to anger the gods. I don't know if this was the best idea to have done this. So that being said, let's see. Yeah, we're about out of time for another quick pause. So we'll leave you with that, and then we'll come back with a little romance in the air in the story. Trying to do a nice transition there, and you just laugh into the mic.
You can't just do that to me.
All right. Well,
break time.
We'll be back. And we're back, ladies and gentlemen. As Gilgamesh is finishing up his conquests, he returns to Uruk, but he catches the eye of a certain goddess named Ishtar, who is the goddess of love and war, and she decides that she's smitten with Gilgamesh's heroic journey, his determination, his confidence. And she decides to come down to Uruk, and she proposes marriage to him. She says, hey, like, I want to marry you, and yeah, so can we do that? So
quite the proposal.
I'm paraphrasing here. It's much more eloquent in the original.
I know.
But Gilgamesh basically just laughs at her. And he's like, no, I'm not going to marry you, you quack. You've had all these past lovers, and he goes on to list them by name. He's like, you've had this past lover, and then you didn't like what he did, and you turned him into a frog or something. And then you had this past lover, and you basically had him killed, and you had this past lover and did this. So yeah, no, I'm not going to marry you, but thanks anyway, screw off kind of a thing. And so she throws a tantrum and goes crying back to heaven and goes to her father, Anu, and throws a fit in front of him, basically. Like, Gilgamesh has done all of these things. He's insulted me. Are you going to defend my honor, kind of a thing? And Anu listens. The council decides to give Ishtar the Bowl of Heaven, which is referred to as a mighty weapon. It's a beast that can cause earthquakes, make the earth split, and even dry up the rivers. And this is all described in the original texts. It also is described as having horns of lapis lazuli. So
basically it's just the dad getting like revenge and...
Well, yeah, the gods are kind of angry.
More symbolizing divine wrath, basically. Yeah,
the gods are angry at Enkidu and Gilgamesh for chopping down the cedar forest, and then their insult to Ishtar. So they, give Ishtar permission to, use this weapon on the heroes. So Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight the Bowl of Heaven, and it's an epic battle that's described. I think it's like where Enkidu ends up like grabbing the tail and then ends up like pinned into one of the earthquake splits that the Bowl of Heaven causes. And there's like 100 warriors or something like that falls into this pit from this chasm that splits open in the earth. And Enkidu holds the Bowl of Heaven down, and Gilgamesh is able to slay it. My memory serves me right. And then...
Slay.
Yeah. So the bowl is dead, and Ishtar is pouting about it because her plans for vengeance have failed. And Enkidu sees her, running away, so he rips off one of the hind legs of the bowl and chucks it at her and just says, get out of here. And all of that, of course.
I love that.
Yeah. All of that, of course, further angers the gods. And so the council convenes, and the gods decree that one of the two, for all of their arrogance or all their hubris, has to die. And they end up deciding on Enkidu. So Enkidu, one of the two, they just decided Enkidu for some reason.
Okay.
And Enkidu starts having visions of the underworld. He gets terribly sick. He's bedridden for several weeks. He's going through this agonizing time in his life where he's sick and he knows he's dying. He even curses the prostitute initially that seduced him, and then recants his curse and blesses her. Gilgamesh is struggling in this time as well, because obviously he's going through the grief over the idea of losing his dear friend, but he's also having a realization, an epiphany. He's seeing his own mortality here, that even though he's 2/3 god, 1/3 man, he's going to die at some point, and that Enkidu's fate is going to be his fate unless he does something about it. So he's facing not only with the loss of a dear friend, but also his own existential crisis and place in the world too.
So also with this story of, the tension between gods and humans, there's also the just immortality versus mortality.
Right, yeah.
Theme, I should say, themes.
And so since Gilgamesh has that mortality twined to him, he's destined to die someday. And eventually, Enkidu does die. And Gilgamesh is so struck with grief that he won't even let anyone bury Enkidu for almost a whole week. It's not until like the worms start eating away at his body and everything that he finally gives permission to be like, okay, fine, you can bury him. So Gilgamesh goes through a hard time. And then he sets out on a quest after Enkidu's death. He realizes that he needs to attain immortality. And here's where things start getting interesting, because he's familiar with this figure that has immortality known as Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim is, let's see. Yeah, I'll save that surprise for the next chapter, actually. But Utnapishtim is this figure that has the gift of eternal life. And so Gilgamesh decides to start tracking this man down to figure out the secret, to fight him for the secret of eternal life, and to be able to attain it for himself. So Gilgamesh is so shaken in who he is at this point that, before he had no problem facing down and fighting people, winning conflicts, without a concern. But he's so shaken by this journey that like he runs into some lions on his quest, and he's actually afraid of them because he's afraid of dying at their hands. He does end up getting the upper hand. He wears the lion skins as a cloak. But that's just how shaken he is to his core. That something that was easy for him to do once is now terrifying. So he journeys to the end of the world, basically, is what it's called. Now, where that is, I don't know, but that's what it's referred to in the Sumerian and Babylonian tablets. And he runs into a tavern keeper, and she at first sees him coming, and she's like, this guy looks scary because he's worn, he's dirty, he's all cut up and everything from his journeys. So she locks the door and everything. And then Gilgamesh introduces himself, and she's familiar with him. And she's like, okay, I'll introduce you to someone that can help. And so she introduces him to Urshanabi, who's a ferryman that can take Gilgamesh across the quote unquote waters of death to meet Utnapishtim, who is the man that Gilgamesh is trying to find. Mm-hmm. So Urshanabi, they kind of have a rough start. Gilgamesh jumps out and ambushes him and breaks some of Urshanabi's stuff that he needs to cross the waters of death. So then Gilgamesh has to think outside the box and use some trees to help get across as like big poles to push across the water. And Urshanabi helps him do that, and they reach Utnapishtim. So Gilgamesh finds Utnapishtim. It's an old man named Gilgamesh. He's ready to fight him for the gift of eternal life. And instead, Utnapishtim tells him a story that some of our listeners might be familiar with, in fact. The story of a great flood. Utnapishtim then tells Gilgamesh about how Ea, the god, spoke to the reeds and told Utnapishtim to build an ark of equal length to width. The exact phraseology there is that all of its sides are in harmony. Mm-hmm. So basically to build a giant wooden Rubik's Cube to help visualize it for the listeners. Yeah. And then he used pitched and plugs to seal it up, and that they took all the animals on it and everything. Starts to sound very similar to the story of Noah here. Mm-hmm. And this deluge lasted 6 days and 7 nights. And then the boat ran aground on the mountain of Nemush, also previously known as Nasir, depending on the translation you want to read there. And then, again, you start to see a lot of parallels here with the story of Noah, where after 6 days, Utnapishtim releases a dove and it returns. Then he releases other birds, and he kind of uses that to gauge, okay, it's safe to leave. Everything's started to dry up enough that, the floodwaters are indeed receding. So he comes out, makes a sacrifice to the gods, and all the gods gather around to enjoy it, except for Enlil, who is the god that instigated the flood. And Enlil was furious because all of humanity was supposed to be wiped out. But all the other gods get mad at Enlil, and they're like, you brought on a calamity far worse than we expected you to. How could you do something so horrible? You could have done famines. You could have done any number of things to reduce the numbers of humanity. You didn't have to do something this extreme. And so Enlil kind of backs off, and Utnapishtim is granted eternal life at that point.
Does it say why he caused a flood?
Yes, so that goes into other Sumerian myth we'll hit on, but the phraseology that's used is that the noise of humanity got too loud for the gods, and that the gods wanted to wipe out humanity because of that. And you actually see that phraseology used in pre-creation in the 7 tablets of creation as well, which we'll talk about in an upcoming episode. But bear that in mind. Good thought.
I also have another question about Utnapishtim.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that he had the gift of immortality, or just eternal life.
Yes.
Does it say how he got that, or how he was immortal himself?
I don't remember that specifically from the text. I think it was just a gift from the gods after he survived the flood, where they're like, okay, you're granted eternal life. I'll have some things to add on that when we get to the end here, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Alrighty.
So Gilgamesh wants the gift of eternal life. He's not going to fight Utnapishtim for it. But Utnapishtim's like, okay, you have this quest you're on, but it's futile. You're not going to be able to attain it. And I'll show you the futility of it. And so he says to Gilgamesh that I want you to stay awake for a whole week. Just fight off temporary death, sleep. See if you can do that. And so how they do it is they actually make a loaf each day, a loaf of like bread, probably like naan or something like that, traditional, Middle Eastern type of bread. And each day they lay a loaf at Gilgamesh's head, and it marks the time that he was asleep. And I think he fell asleep like on the first day or something like that. So he royally fails this challenge to stay awake for a whole week. So he's defeated. He's like, I can't even beat sleep. You're right, Utnapishtim. I'm not going to live forever. And so he decides to leave defeated. And just as he's about to depart to go back to Uruk, Utnapishtim's wife comes up and whispers into Utnapishtim's ear. And she's like, don't let him go home empty-handed. He's come all this way. You see how dejected he is. Give him something for his travels. And so Utnapishtim finally then reveals to Gilgamesh that at the bottom of a sea nearby, there is a seaweed that if consumed will give him eternal life. So immediately the tone of the story here changes. Gilgamesh goes and he ties rocks to his ankles and he sinks to the bottoms of the sea, finds the seaweed, rips it by the roots, all of it, and goes back to the surface. And Urshanabi decides to join him and return with Gilgamesh to Uruk to accompany him on this journey. Because I think at this point Urshanabi is just kind of invested in the quest. Like, dude, you got eternal life, like sweet. And so Gilgamesh is boasting to Urshanabi. He's like, we're going to go back and we're going to give this to the old men of Uruk first, and we're going to test it on them and see them rejuvenate their youth. And once they do that, then we'll consume it and we're going to live forever. And, we've got this, we've done it. We've achieved this quest. And so they're journeying back, and along their journeys back to Uruk, because it is a long ways, one of the nights, Gilgamesh and Urshanabi both pass out. They're exhausted, and a snake catches the scent of the seaweed, the sweet aroma of it. And the snake slithers into camp, eats it, and then sheds its skin as a token of gratitude, if you will, as a symbology of its reincarnation, or not reincarnation, but like rebirth into immortality, and then slithers off. Gilgamesh and Urshanabi wake up and they see the skin and the seaweed missing, and they put two and two together as to what happened, and they're distraught because the quest has failed. Gilgamesh took the entire seaweed, so there's nothing left. So they get back, and Gilgamesh kind of has another epiphany here. He's looking around and he's like, Urshanabi, look at all of these great walls I built. Look at the temples that I built. Look at everything that I was able to accomplish. Like I might not have immortality, but I've done a lot of great things. And so we see him start to accept kind of his humanity, if you will, that human part of himself, the limitations of that. Mm-hmm. And he starts to really find solace in these mortal achievements that he's done. And he starts reflecting, and he starts thinking, and he realizes that pursuing in pursuit of meaning, in pursuit of eternal life, he has actually achieved immortality in a sense. That it's not about literally living forever, but it's about making a name for yourself. It's about having a story to pass down for generations that will be retold over and over again.
So it's not him living for eternal life, but his name.
Yes.
Living for eternal life.
And that's where he starts to, kind of connect the dots and be like, I actually, in a way, I did achieve my quest. Like, I've built all these great walls. I've lived an epic life. I've created a great story. And you see him kind of have this realization and shift from, being a real bad tyrant to not being so insufferable, being much more tolerable as a leader and as a king, being invested in his people and being determined to serve them and be a good king. So that right there, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, an epic retelling of the story for you. We're going to take another ad pause here, and we will come back to hit a bunch of comparative mythology points and other closeouts. So we hope you tune it back in just a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, every 11 episodes up until now, we've taken you with us metaphorically on a physical journey that we've gone on to. But this is the first time that we're actually diving into mythology and taking you on a metaphorical journey ourselves back in time, quantumly transcending the barriers of time, to the story of Gilgamesh, or Bilgamesh, depending on how you want to translate it, and his lost friendship with Enkidu, his wrestlings for immortality. That being said, one thing I didn't hit on is legal talk. I'm going to put a legal disclaimer in here. This is all paraphraseology of the story, which is all well within fair use. There are certain snippets I did grab from various sources to hit on certain highlights. I'll put a list of those in the show notes. But a couple of the books I'll hit on here, I have them both in front of me. If you're interested to learn more about these, I highly recommend Myths of Mesopotamia. It's a whole compilation of the 7 tablets of creation, the flood story, Gilgamesh's story, and various other mythologies from the Mesopotamian region. And then from Penguin Classics as well, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So those were not my primary sources, but they were used to augment the story and fill in a lot of gaps, add a lot of extra details in that would have, not a lot, but some extra details that would have been missing in the story that helped make the story better. So if you want more information, you actually want to read what the original tablets say, in our translations of them, definitely recommend both those sources. Also a ton of YouTube videos that have done recaps of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that being said, I think I gave you, because I surprised you coming back from that ad break there. So
yeah, you didn't tell me that we were going to start recording, but that's fine. I
think I gave you enough of a rant there on my legal disclaimer, so you should be good on your end. So let's talk comparative mythology points of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I think the most glaring one, first and foremost, is Utnapishtim compared to Noah. And you have a flood. You have referenced a quote-unquote deluge that lasts for 7 days, 6 nights, 6 days, 7 nights, one of those two. The biblical account is much longer. I think it was like 40 days or something of rain, and then the flood itself lasts actually for a whole year before the waters start, or close to a year before the waters start receding. So that's first and foremost. There's a lot of similarities there in the flood account, but there's also a lot of differences. The arc described that Utnapishtim used was described as basically a Rubik's Cube. That's what the modern translation of it is. Versus the biblical arc is described as a 6-to-1 length to width ratio. So that's like 300 cubits by 50 cubits length to width. And then I think it was like 30 cubits high or something like that. I'm going off the top of my head with all of this, but
you kind of compared it to our modern day cargo ships.
Yep.
So that's what that is.
So those following our social media platform, depending on the cargo ship, you've probably already seen this if you're following our social media platforms, but cargo ships will be anywhere from a 5-to-1 to a 7-to-1 ratio, depending on the type of cargo they're hauling and what specifically they're made for. And so a 6-to-1 ratio of length to width falls perfectly within that range. So it doesn't automatically mean that the flood of the Bible happened and that arc was real, but it's definitely an interesting point to hit on, to be like, hey, they got a surprising detail right. And we compare that to something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where we have a lot of different versions of it, and we know it's kind of been embellished at certain points. And so we can kind of look at those two and be like, okay, the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't have the details right in terms of something that would work, because a cube wouldn't work. It would be a spin cycle for 7 days and 7 nights.
When we went to the Ark encounter, they actually had a display of this.
Yes.
Yeah, and they had a couple of other different kinds of quote-unquote arcs from different stories.
They built the Akkadian arc as well, which
like
is described as like
disc.
a disc shape that has like kind of a cone underside and then had a house on top. And then they built all of these to scale from the actual dimensions of everything and show each of them. And then they had a simulator to show how all these different craft fared in the water.
Yep.
And so it's an interesting comparative mythology point that, if you're looking solely on the claim of a reliable craft, that the ark in the Bible is the only one that would really hold up out of any of them, if any would. of course. So I mean, that's the most clear and present comparative mythology point that I have. But I have plenty of others, but I'll give you the floor so you can kind of add some of your thoughts.
Okay. My biggest thing was like the seaweed and the snake. That was kind of an interesting detail.
Yeah.
Because I know it's not the flood, but Adam and Eve, they had a snake and the apple. So
depending on how you want to read Genesis 3, you could also claim that the snake stole immortality from humanity in a sense, and that's kind of what happens here as well. Is that Gilgamesh had eternal life in his grasp and then lost it. So it's a very interesting story on that front as well.
I also had a comment because Greek mythology, is that the one that has demigods?
Well, I mean, all of them kind of have demigods in a sense. So the gods that are described here, there's different tiers of these gods. But
I'm thinking that, Gilgamesh would be considered a demigod, but that's like half. That's not.
Yeah, so he had a little
2/3, 1/3.
Yeah, he had a little more in his favor there, which is an interesting comparison.
Yeah.
Especially when you start looking at and thinking about how like Nephilim and these angels mixing together. You can start drawing out that comparative mythology point to be like, they're distinguishing that they had a connection, like a genetical connection with the gods here at certain points. And you see that also referenced where, the sons of God came down and took, for themselves wives as they chose in Genesis 6. And so you start looking at these two parallels and you do start to see a common theme here. And then you start, like you said, you correctly said, Greek mythology. We start looking at Greek myth and you see the same thing where, again, since this is more of an explicit episode, I can say this. Zeus was basically sex crazed and lots of women and had lots of kids, and he made his wife very jealous.
You did not put the R word trigger thing.
I guess I'll bleep that out. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll bleep that out. That's fine. So... but you see all these common trends throughout all of the myth here. But what would be your thoughts on that?
On what specifically?
Just on you brought up the Greek myth. So there's 3 different mythologies we're looking at here that all talk about this intermixing of something from above and humanity mixing together.
It's not even just that, but there's so many other cultures too that have stories either, similar or some other story about a flood. And
yeah, it's all over the world.
Yeah.
I posted a recent YouTube short talking about comparison between Sumerian flood myth and the biblical flood myth. And someone commented that, oh, well, they just stole from each other. And it's like, well, actually there's Hindu flood myths, there's Aztec flood myth, there's a Norse flood myth. Cultures all over the world that aren't connected have these.
Now, some of them could be.
Yeah, some of them could be borrowing from each other, sure, but they're each distinct enough in their own ways where it doesn't seem too likely.
Now, I would propose that if they were stolen, they would embellish them to fit their culture more.
They would. You're right.
But I'm not going to say that they were stolen because I have no idea.
And so here's the problem here, because again, Billy Carson likes to...
Good old Billy Carson.
Yeah, he just lost his debate with Wes Huff, and his response to it was very underwhelming.
He's struggling.
Yeah, he's kind of lost all his credibility at this point, which, anyway. But there's a quote from him that I have on our social media that says that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the long-form version that the Bible stole from. What's ironic about that is, number one, the Epic of Gilgamesh's account of the flood. I actually put this into a word counter because I'm curious about this, right? Like, is there any credibility to this? Because I'm not going to, even though it's Billy Carson, I'm not going to automatically dismiss a claim because it's Billy Carson. Because Billy Carson has said things that are actually somewhat valid points at times.
Right.
So I'm like, let me do some research into this. I'm curious. So I took the Genesis account of the flood. It's like Genesis 6 through 9 approximately, like depending on how you split it up. And I took all that, I threw it into a word counter, and I threw the Epic of Gilgamesh into a word counter. And the Bible's account was several hundred words longer. So saying that the Epic of Gilgamesh is a long form version, Billy is very clearly unaware of how these texts actually read. So that was kind of like my first realization with all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, but yes, this is the English version of our translation. So, I mean, a margin of several hundred words means that the Hebrew text would probably still be longer in Hebrew versus the cuneiform Sumerian, but there's a margin of error there. So I'm like, okay, let me take a little bit deeper of a look. The Epic of Gilgamesh's account of the flood, it does read partially like a narrative, but it also has elements of poetry intertwined with it. So there's certain aspects that are repeat phrases or similar information being presented. Like, and like this is an example. I'm not quoting directly. I'm kind of just making this up off the top of my head to show an example, but something like, and I entered the ark and then was inside of the ark, and from inside of the ark I sat and looked out upon the waters, like, bursting forth, or something like that, where you have a lot of repeat information being said there, versus when you go into the Genesis account of the flood, it reads like a strict narrative according to linguistic Hebrew. It flows. You got novel information in virtually every single line. You don't have a lot of repeat information, metaphor, symbology being conveyed in the text, but you do have that in the Epic of Gilgamesh's account of the flood. So saying that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the long form version just shows that there hasn't been study of these actual texts done in depth, because that's not what the evidence shows. And I challenge you as a listener, especially if that throws you up in arms, me disagreeing with Billy Carson, go do the research yourself. Go take the account of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the account of the Bible's flood, Genesis 6-9 approximately, and I think it's tablet 9 of Gilgamesh, maybe, something in there. You can easily find it if you Google it or ChatGPT it, and then you can pull that source online and you can test it yourself, and you can read through both yourself.
They're very interesting.
So if anything, I'd say the Epic of Gilgamesh probably copied the original source material from the Bible, just from the lengths and the metaphorical language and the claims the Genesis account gets right that it shouldn't know. And we don't see that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, at least as far as I've noticed. So I think another point to tie into talking about this comparative mythology point for gods and humanity intermingling is that it depicts Enkidu falling to the ground as a star, which I think is an interesting metaphor. In Gilgamesh's dream in the beginning, in the first tablet, when he has a dream of Enkidu appearing, he dreams him as one of the three dreams is as a star from the heavens, as a strong star from the heaven. And you got to wonder, is that like a meteor that it's talking about? Is it a fallen angel that it's talking about? Like what is Gilgamesh actually seeing here? But it's just an interesting thought. It kind of adds an extra dimension. I don't have an answer on that one, but that it adds an extra dimension to the story, if you will.
I mean, if you think about stars, think celestial, think, otherworldly, that sort of thing.
Right.
And that can kind of tie into the immortality too versus mortality.
Right. And then you also have the interesting comparison where angels are sometimes associated with stars. And then there was that one star that was spotted that seems to have those Dyson spheres or whatever on it that resemble the description of angels in Ezekiel with the spinning wheels.
Oh, yeah.
There's that. I think that's what it's called. It's the
Starts
Dyson,
with an O.
The Dyson spheres, but that's like the scientific name. And they're seeing these stars that have these things. And so what you got to start questioning what the validity of all this is, what the root of all of this is.
See right here, it says Mesopotamian culture were often linked, like the stars were often linked to gods and divine will.
Yeah. Okay.
So right there.
Yeah. So yeah, and you have this huge connection to the stars. So I don't know. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of interesting thoughts to add in here, and how that ties into.
I'm also thinking, like if people are into horoscopes, like I'm thinking that too. Because people, like, if you believe in horoscopes, you believe fate's written in the stars. Like,
yeah, that's
kind
true.
of. So there's also that, where, like, I'm trying to think of how to word it, but basically that Enkidu's fate was written in the stars or something like that.
Yeah, they were kind of like fated by the stars, if you will, to meet.
Yeah.
So, which is interesting.
I don't know. That was just a thought,
Yeah,
like, horoscopes and everything. Like if somebody's interested in that, then yeah.
Yeah. Another thing I'll hit on here, I know we're kind of bouncing around all over the place, is that the dialogue starts off, I think within the first tablet, that Gilgamesh, quote, brought back a tale of before the deluge, referring to the Great Deluge, and that's the flood. And that's how the story starts out before it even introduces Gilgamesh fully, I believe. But again, it refers to the deluge, like I think it's like a proper noun or whatever, where it's like not saying a deluge, it's like the deluge, like that there's this emphasis on a specific event and not just, oh, it rained, but no, the rain, like the storm, not a storm, the storm, like everyone relates to it. And you also see this in, I believe it's the Timaeus dialogues, either Timaeus or Critias dialogues, where Plato talks about Atlantis. He also makes a reference to this noun of the deluge, not a deluge, because he in fact goes on to say that there were many deluges after, but that there was a singular the deluge.
This makes me think of like National Treasure, the movie.
Yeah, right. Like how so specifically, but
I forget what exactly he said, but it's like not the, or maybe it's not even that movie.
Oh yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I forget what. Let's take an ad break and figure that out, because we're about time on that anyway, and I want an answer on that. But I know what you're talking about.
That's gonna drive me nuts until I figure that out.
Yeah. All right. We'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, we have returned, and Maddie has the answer for us. Go ahead.
So it was the National Treasure movie, but basically he was talking about Charlotte, and they were saying who's Charlotte, and he said not who, it says the Charlotte. You mean it was a ship?
Yeah.
So like the is very symbolic, like the very much points you to what something could be.
Right. And
just that word.
Yes, and these are English translations I'm going off of here, but there is an emphasis that these translators are pulling to emphasize that there was the deluge, not a deluge, like your standard, Charlotte, it's the Charlotte kind of a thing.
And I just said that using the word the makes people think of the biggest thing that stands out in their mind. So when you say the deluge, you think of the biggest deluge. Yeah. That had the most catastrophic impact or whatever.
Exactly. And see, the thing is,
the biggest impact.
These cultures wouldn't have to worry about like, oh, we're talking about the Great Flood, like the big flood that Noah and his whole family survived. They wouldn't have to quantify that. If they experienced that, that would be ingrained in the minds of humanity for generations, for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have to be like, oh, the Great Flood, the one from the Bible that Noah, blah, 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 blah. It would just be like, no, the deluge. Oh, that one.
That one.
Yes.
Yes.
And so there does seem to be this collective memory that's inferred to a very powerful deluge. So at the very least, if you don't want to say that there's a global flood, you can't deny that there were at least a series of incredibly massive storms and very powerful local floods that would contribute to this collective memory you see spread across 4 different mythologies, because it's actually, just from the ones we're looking at here, we have biblical, so Hebrew mythology, creation. We have Sumerian, and then we have the Atlantis account, which is Greek, but it's rooted in Egyptian mythology. The Egyptian priests passed it on to Solon.
I did not know that.
So those are your 4 components, you 4 different cultures all culminating together to say, hey, there was the deluge, as opposed to a deluge. There's the deluge.
Right.
So it's an interesting comparative mythology point that really emphasizes, and people just want to be like, oh, there's no flood. Science has proven that there's no flood. It's like, yet there's whale bones in Egypt, and all these cultures have stories of a flood that seem to be global. So how are you so sure when everything that our ancestors are passing down to us says the exact opposite? At the very least, like, that should be enough reason to pause and do some critical thinking and some more research, and then to say, oh, I absolutely know for sure there was no flood anywhere from 4,000 to 20,000 years ago. I'm that smart with science. I just know that. And it's like,
to trust somebody that says a statement like that just because of a job title, isn't that a logical fallacy?
Appeal to authority. Thank you. I was just about to say that. Yep.
I got you.
Thanks. I appreciate it. It's also worth noting that the flood weapon is mentioned, and so it's unclear by Humbaba. Humbaba had the flood weapon in the epic here. I think that the flood weapon is referring to local floods here because, excuse me, I think it's referring to local floods because you would also have where the Tigris and Euphrates would seasonally flood, much like how the Nile would flood depending on the season, which would contribute to like irrigation and watering and everything else like that. And so my thought is that this is probably referring to the flood weapon to trigger the ebb and flow of like the Tigris and the Euphrates, because you don't see it being referenced, I don't think, as more of a proper noun flood weapon. It's just more of like, it's just the flood weapon, as opposed to like the cause of the great flood by the gods. I think this is a different thing that's being referred to in the context here. But I mean, that's something that's my personal inference. It's a personal take on it. So that's open to discussion. Anything you wanted to add on that?
No.
All right. I do think Enkidu and Sasquatch connection, which you previously made, is definitely an interesting one as well. That's an interesting rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
Hairy man running around in the woods that's big and stocky, dismantling traps and seen and terrifying the locals.
Did it say how big Enkidu was?
So that's the thing, is we don't actually have a good...
if he's like a wild man, you would think bigger, like more beast-like.
So here's where it gets interesting.
If it's scary enough for that guy setting traps.
So Enkidu and Gilgamesh in artwork and Sumerian, Mesopotamian artwork are often depicted as being very big in comparison to other things like people and lions. Like there's, I think there's like a sketch. It's like a formal Sumerian like carving into a pillar or something of Gilgamesh, and he's holding a lion like you would hold a cat, like literally in his arms. Like he's holding it, and it's like, you know, torso length for him. And he's just like holding it like this.
Dang.
You know, like hugging it to his
body.
body.
So basically a giant.
So there's two interpretations you can do on that. Number one, a lot of historians will side with, because most historians don't like to admit that there was actually giants, which that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But
yeah.
Interpretation number one on that is that it's depicting big, like people, like metaphorically, like significant people, like how the president would be significant. And so that's why they depicted them large, to emphasize that, hey, this person was important, these other people not so much. The other one is that it's very literal, and that it's telling us that Gilgamesh could literally pick up and hold lions in his arms like kittens, which that starts to align with the description you see in Genesis 6 of how the sons of God came down to the daughters of men, and they had, you know, the Nephilim, the great men of renown that were also referred to as giants. And so again, you start seeing all these things spin together. And so you got to wonder, was Gilgamesh like 12 feet tall or something? So
maybe.
But yeah, no, good.
I mean, we do have modern day, I don't want to call them giants, but we do have modern day people that
are very tall,
7 foot, or maybe even a little bit taller than that.
But there's certain genetic limits on that where like you start to have more deformities when you get that old. Your joints don't function as well. Your cardiovascular system's not built to support that.
And your genetics do change over time. Versus
like, you know, the way these heroes are described back then, you know, the men of renown, is that they were very accomplished, elite warriors, if you will, that were able to handle being, you know, 8, 10, 12, 14 feet, like Goliath. But yeah. I do think it's interesting to discuss, too, how in a lot of these stories, dreams do possess divine insight, but the ability to interpret dreams is not always given to the dream giver. You also see this with the story of Joseph in the Bible, where he's given the ability to interpret dreams, and he interprets dreams for the Pharaoh and for other people that he's in jail cell with. That's, if you're not familiar with that story, that's a whole nother story. He goes from being in jail to being second in command of the whole kingdom. It's quite a jump, but you do see this common trend, and it's interesting. And you got to wonder, you know, with our scientific approach, looking at things like dreams, how much are we actually missing that there could be more to what we're experiencing every single night, as opposed to, oh, it's just our subconscious running. Well, yeah, that's certainly part of it, I'm sure. But is that all of it? Or is there something much more going on, something much bigger? Especially, which I know you're going to hit on as well, when we get to talking about lucid dreaming in relation to dreaming. Like, how do all these things intertwine together? So, I do think it's interesting. One thing that kind of stood out to me, because I like to keep an open mind about these kind of things, is like, okay, what exactly is the bowl of heaven? And, you know, we're not really given a lot of great concrete description on that. But I do think it's interesting that the Enkidu falls, and he almost falls into this pit, and he's up to his waist near this beast, near its back. And then he gets incredibly sick and dies shortly thereafter. So like one of the things that starts running in the background of my mind almost immediately, because you see a lot of accounts of UFOs where people get radiation poisoning. Did Enkidu maybe get radiation poisoning, and maybe that's what was going on here or something? Maybe the Bull of Heaven was some more kind of advanced piece of like almost alien technology. I don't know. I liked it. I know it sounds Billy Carson-esque, but...
Billy Carson-esque.
Look, Billy Carson, I don't like how he presents like he's like study these texts in depth, and it becomes clear when you listen to him and you actually look at what he's saying in relation to what the texts say, that they think these things don't line up. But he does ask, the premise he presents of ancient aliens and all these other things is good premises to present. They are good questions to ask. We just can't tout it as fact the way that he does, because there's just not the evidence to corroborate it. But it's good to speculate on it, and it's good to keep that kind of perspective in mind as you dig deeper in all these things, I think.
Right. It's important to keep an open mind about anything.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's, we won't have the answer on this. What is the Bull of Heaven? I don't know. I mean, you would have to, and this is where, my limitations shine is, I can read a little bit of elementary Hebrew, but especially with interlinear tools to assist, but I am nowhere near equipped to go in and read original cuneiform, understand the context of cuneiform, thousands of years before Hebrew culture, where we have very limited information to infer the meanings of certain words. Mm-hmm. And so do they mean a literal Bull of Heaven, or do they mean something that, they didn't have the words for, and so the best way to describe it was like
more in a poetic sense.
Was like, it was like a bull, like how we describe like spaceships. Like right. it's basically just a ship that's in space. Like, what's a ship? Well, a ship is like something that sails on the ocean. But yet that's the best word we have for something that's in space, even though we've had space travel for quite some time. Well, depending on, I know Phil DeMattis would disagree with me on that one. But depending on, who you talk to about like the moon landings and space travel and all of that, call them spaceships. Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of bearing that in mind. When you see chariots, translated in the Bible, are they referring to chariots, or are they referring to something different? It gets hard to split those semantics, and you have to look at the context around it to kind of discern that. Let's see here. What else is worth hitting? Because there's so many comparative myth points that we could hit, which that's like comparative myth is what I nerd out about. So, but we're already running a little long on this. We'll have to take another break soon here. But we hit that one. Yeah, I do think it's interesting that the cedar forest is depicting as having like a guardian as well, Humbaba. And then you contrast that to in Genesis 3 when God positions an angel to guard the tree of life. Mm. It's just an interesting note there that it does seem to be this kind of symbology, connection of trees connecting us to the divine in a sense, where the cedar forest is described as being divine. It's a forest of the gods, if you will. And then you see this kind of similar trend with the Garden of Eden in a sense, about how it's like God's garden and the tree of life resides there. So it's a faint comparative mythology point.
Is there a reason why they specifically said cedar? Is there is there something symbolic about cedar?
So yes, you hit another good point where we have to ask how much of this is true and how much of this all is symbology.
Right.
I think a lot of this does bleed to be true, but I think embellishment and myth has bled into this story as seen by different versions of it. Yeah. But why cedar? So that's a great question you bring up. A lot of historians, I think, will correlate this to potentially being like the cedars of Lebanon, which was a relatively well-known place. The exact location, of course, I think is uncertain, because we're talking about a forest that was 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. So we would have no way to absolutely quantify it, but it's either cedar or pine forest, and that just would have been like kind of like a reference point, I think, for the people back then, and that would be my best understanding for it. Kind of like how in the Critias and Timaeus dialogues they reference the Pillars of Hercules of being the location where Spain and Africa almost touch. Like it's just reference points in terminology they would understand.
I love that you're just like a walking encyclopedia. You just like pulled that out of your pocket.
Yeah. I like this stuff Because I read this.
It shows.
I read like a paraphrased version of this, like in probably 5th or 6th grade for my homeschool program. Like not the whole story, but like a paraphrased version of it.
Okay.
In one of my comparative mythology books. I was fascinated by it. And, it kind of faded away for a while and then like came back. And it's like, yeah, I gotta dive into this stuff, especially with all the Billy Carson stuff going on. It's like someone needs to come out and actually tell the true stories of these mythology accounts. I might get some details wrong. And if I do, I have no problem admitting that. Like I'm not perfect. I'm taking and I'm paraphrasing the story for you as the reader, or the listener, for it to be more palatable to your ears. And then to start drawing these connections, and connect not only telling you the story, but also how do we translate this into comparative mythology? So one last comparative myth point I'm going to hit, and then I'm going to kind of tie up the relevance of all of this here. So the mountain that the ark comes to rest on is described as Namush or Nasir, depending on the translation. So Nasir was like, I think, a mistranslation or something, and then they corrected it later to be Namush, at least from what I was able to delineate from a quick Google research expedition. But I took a look and pulled up where Ararat, Mount Ararat, and Nasir is. So Nasir is like kind of the northern region of Iraq, and then Ararat would be the far eastern tip of Turkey. Okay. So these are not the same mountain, at least as far as we're aware, and we're able to delineate, but they are still relatively close to each other. I mean, it's just like, it's about like the width of Turkey away. It's not outrageously. I don't know how to quantify.
Like compared to the entire world, it's not.
Yeah, I'm not
that far.
I'm not on Google Maps, so I can't quantify this. But like, it's not ridiculously far in relation to like mythology stories.
Right.
So, it's worth noting that they do differentiate the mountains, and that would be a way to verify the accounts. That would actually be a way to do falsification on like the Bible. If one of these accounts did happen, do we find an ark on Ararat, or do we find an ark on Namush? Do we find a cube ark on Namush? Because then obviously that changes everything. Because the Epic of Gilgamesh has more credibility than we thought.
Right.
Versus Ararat, which I think they have made some headway in that. I think it was like Rick Renner, who's the author of the sparkling gems that we sometimes read. Yeah. He's partnered up with some people and been out to Ararat, and they found something that they theorize could be the petrified remains of the actual ark. We've talked about that on the show, I think, back when we were doing the Flood series. Okay. But that right there, approaching from a more scientific, logical perspective, that's a good falsification point right there. Is where is the ark? And that also contends the idea of a local flood, where if two accounts are telling us that the ark came to rest on one of the highest mountains, obviously the water had to be above the highest mountains. You can't say that the arks came to, just happened up there without the water level being higher than that. So both of these events are very clearly talking about a global flood. Like there really isn't any room for that. Now, if you want to take that as literal or not, that's your prerogative, but there isn't room when both these accounts are describing very tall mountains to be like, oh, it's just a small local flood.
Right.
It's not really there. But yeah, I mean,
because the ark can't fly up to the mountain.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, one commenter on our social media did disagree with me on that point, that said it wasn't a water ship, it was a spaceship, the ark. Remember that comment?
Or it drank a bunch of Red Bull and gave it wings. Free advertisement for Red Bull.
There you go. All right, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, Mystery Seekers, we're going to take a last pause here, and then we'll be right back to hit some final points and do our housekeeping items. Ladies and gentlemen, Mystery Seekers, Musers, we have returned to you from the ends of the world the quantum transcendings to Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, brought back to life the story of Gilgamesh, an epic retelling. So the question then becomes, where you have a lot of these timeless truths of, life lessons learned of, it's an honest story of Gilgamesh wrestling with his human aspects of mortality, wrestling with his friend dying, wanting to leave a name for himself, desiring to be a better ruler after being a bad ruler. Where there's a lot of embarrassing things told about him in the beginning, and that, he probably wrote down and okayed, and that, it was all part of his journey to become a better person, become a better ruler, become a better king. So, before we go any further here, definitely think about how this resonates with you as the listener. How does this connect to, the modern struggles that we face? How does it connect the societal context that we might face? If you have anything you want to add, please email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. Whether it's thoughts on the story, relations on the story, comparative myth insights, other insights, just don't send your logical fallacies or we will ridicule you. That being said, I think that's about it for this episode here. We're going to have a couple, I'm not quite sure the next sequence of episodes we're going to have. We are going to hit the 7 Tablets of Creation, the Enuma Elish, in the very near future. That will be one of the next episodes. I'm also trying to do a Christmas episode to talk about Santa Claus and some kind of beliefs and concerns there. So that looks like the next one after this one releases. Also slotted to get Harrison Smith back on to do Is the Bible Viable Part 3. So we're going to be all over the place with episodes, so bear with us for the next week or so here. I've got some epic guests coming up in the coming months, one of which is you going to be breaking down a lot of psychology. Yeah, one of the psychology, a whole bunch of psychology stuff for us.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, well... So you had a fact check for us, dear, because I mentioned something from an episode and you identified
You had mentioned it in passing and I was like, wait, I don't think that's right. And it was something Carl had actually said about Pika.
So love you, Carl. No one gets all their facts right 100% of the time. Like I've said, we get 80% of our facts wrong 90% of the time. And Carl is definitely no exception to that, but I'll let you,
But he had mentioned that Pika was caused by, I guess, a nutrient deficiency. So it's not caused by nutrient deficiencies, but they are very closely related. Mm-hmm. So when somebody does have Pika, they often do have reported cases of nutrient deficiencies, but that doesn't exactly cause Pika. They're just very closely related. I will say that when somebody does have Pika, they do have more physical problems like, irritable bowel syndrome, intestinal perforation, stuff like that.
Right.
There was something else that I took a bunch of notes on this.
Yeah, well, I mean...
Oh, there was something else too about... with other mental health conditions, with schizophrenia, OCD, intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorder. So they're all very closely related, but basically they're closely related, but one does not cause the other.
It's an honest mistake, which is fine because that's not his field of study.
It's very nuanced.
He's more of a metaphysical, quantum physics, religious text guy. So, I mean, a mistake outside of his field is definitely understandable there, especially with
and it's totally okay.
How many insights he has. But I just wanted to clarify that since psychology is your field of study and Pika is psychology.
But it's more based off of just a disordered mind than a biochemical deficiency. So that it's just...
Pika can be like chewing hair and stuff too, right? Like it can be all sorts of stuff.
It's anything non-nutritive. So it could be hair, it could be rocks, could be soil, could be
chewing nails.
Literally anything.
Yeah.
And it's actually also very closely related to trichotillomania or excoriation. So hair and skin picking. That too.
So basically a fidgeting outlet for anxiety and higher tension, higher energy people. So ADHD, OCD, all that would be high proclivity for... Anyway, sorry, we're both going down psychology.
Yes, but I just wanted to make that known.
Got to fact check ourselves. You know, I've gotten plenty of things wrong on the show. I've had to go back and correct. In fact, Tracy would sometimes correct me on stuff mid-show. So, you know, it's all part of the process here.
Hold up.
We're not perfect.
Yes.
We're seekers of truth. Just like you as the listeners, we've just, you know, taken that extra step to do a lot more research and to create a podcast talking about that research and presenting it. So
I do want to say I found that information in the DSM. If any of you have it, it's a very expensive book. But if you, I sadly needed to buy it for my program. But you can find that information there, or you could find it on NCBI. It's a database for research articles, basically, journal articles. So I found that there too.
Sweet.
And that's free.
You send me the link to the article. I'll just put it in the show notes.
I will put it in the show notes, and
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. There's also some weird stuff going on with UFOs in New Jersey. Apparently, there's been some UFOs spotted that are like the size of cars flying around at very fast speeds, which...
and it's weird because I heard that it was a drone show.
Yeah. So the thing is like if they've identified it, I don't know how credible it is, but this is just hearsay. But if they've identified it as being bigger than cars... There are only a few drones that are bigger than cars, and they're not going to move fast. Those kind of drones are made for like crop spraying and stuff, or like load hauling. They're not made to fly. Or
military grade.
Yeah.
I would think.
Yeah, but those weren't the type of drones that were flying around. They had very sporadic.
That's so weird.
Yeah, they have very sporadic patterns, so it's not like the vertical takeoff drones. I don't know. It's
what were they flying in a specific pattern? Because I think you watched the video. It was
like kind of like loopy patterns, and there's a bunch of them. So
okay. So it wasn't like they were pre-programmed. It was like they had a mind of its own, basically.
That's what it seemed like from a quick watch of the video. But I don't know. So that's
Maybe
interesting.
You'll link the video too.
I'll need to see if I can get Phil back on. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Since he's kind of more the UFO expert that I've come into contact with. That being said, one other thing I'm going to put in here too is definitely, well, I'll actually put two things here before we do closeouts. Refer the show to a friend, please. If you're listening, if you're that dedicated that you've gotten this far, the biggest way that this show is going to start finding a bigger listener base is through word of mouth. So if you have a friend in mind that you think would enjoy this kind of content of, comparative mythology from a truth-seeking yet gently Christian perspective, please refer the show to them. Be like, hey, thought of you. You might want to check this out. Pick out one of the highlight episodes you think would relate. Just you taking like 5 minutes to do that helps us a lot to gain traction. And I know I've been saying this a lot at the end of almost every single episode, but like we definitely need, your help as the listeners continuing to do the show and keeping it running. I have a lot of content to go through, but that's something we just definitely need your support for. To make the show run well. And then
support us.
Also check out the YouTube channel. I'm posting a ton of content on there now. So if you want to hear the 6-minute version of Gilgamesh, that's available. It's like just over 6 minutes. I did a recap with high-speed visuals and everything. Yeah, it's the one you watched.
I watched that. It was so nice. Yeah. I loved it. It has nice pictures. It has all sorts of stuff in there.
So if you're kind of confused by the story and you're like, okay, that was cool, but I don't know who all these characters are. It was too much to mentally juggle. Go check that out because those visuals will kind of help you ground yourself a bit. And then I'm also having the pipes a Enuma Eilish video like that as well. I've done an Atlantis breakdown, Atlantis in, I think, like just under 7 minutes. So I'm going to do a lot of short myth breakdowns on the YouTube channel in video form that you can actually go watch and see. So definitely go check that out. Definitely subscribe there. That's kind of where I'm doing a big push to get a lot of followers and listeners for the show and pushing a lot of content to gain some attention, be like, hey, this is what we're about. If you're interested, we have short form, 30, 60 second reels. We have breakdowns in under 10 minutes. And then we, of course, have the podcast to, try to get the word about the show out there and to connect with, all different walks of life and all different types of content consumers. Mm-hmm. So if you're listening and you haven't subscribed to us on YouTube, please do that. That's definitely a huge help.
If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you doing with your life?
Yeah, Harry, you better have subscribed on YouTube. He said he did, so we're good. He is following us on TikTok too, actually, because he did friend me on there. I did see that.
Thank you, Harry.
So thank you, Harry. Appreciate it. As always, if you want to get a hold of us, you can email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. What?
Buy us a cup of coffee.
Or buy us a book is the literal one is right here.
Oh, buy us a book.
Yeah, buy us a book. But yeah, so our buymeacoffee.com. The link is buymeacoffee.com/m.quad.musings. m.quad.musings is also our handle there, so we make it easy. If you got value and you want to express that value back in monetary form, you can do so there. Send a $5 donation or something to help us keep the lights on, keep the research going, keep the content coming. No pressure for that, of course. I understand that not everyone can do that, but if that's where you're inclined, that's an option available. Our YouTube is Musings on Mysteries and Mythical Matrix, but our handle there is also m.quad.musing. So you type that in, we're going to pop right up. Subscriber base has been substantially growing over the last couple weeks. So
yeah, I saw that and I was actually kind of blown away by how fast it gained traction. So that was pretty cool.
So
thank you.
Yeah, so thank you to all. If any of our YouTube Shorts viewers have made it this far into the podcast, we thank you so much for sticking around for, how long is this episode?
I know,
so far?
This
is over an hour and a half at this point. So thank you for...
I'm surprised I'm still paying attention.
It's because you... Wow, okay.
No, it's not that. ADHD,
boring.
You're not boring.
Okay.
All
right. Anyway, trying to think what else. Facebook, Musings on Mysteries and Mythical Matrix. So we want to hear from the listeners, from those that consume our content. I've been engaged a lot on the YouTube, responding to comments and things that I've been receiving. But yeah, no, if you've got stuff to add, please. I really foresee doing listener communication episodes where we go back and rehash things from however many episodes back, and maybe have return guests to answer questions if there's enough questions for a specific guest. So this is something where I'm a seeker of truth, you're a seeker of truth. Everyone we have on the show is a seeker of truth, or at least an expert in a field that we're wanting to seek.
Right.
And then we're here for you as the listeners, for seekers of truth as well. We want to help discover the truth and learn more about the world, our history, and the mysteries of it all with you. So please don't hesitate to reach out and interact with us. We want to hear, even if you have confessions, concessions, snide remarks, all of that. We want to hear it. Just don't send your logical fallacies.
Don't do it.
We will leave you anonymous, but we will ridicule you publicly on the show if you send us logical fallacy.
Just don't
in Christian
do
love,
it.
of course. But you will
yeah,
get, you will,
Christian love.
You will get ridiculed. So that being said,
that's not very Christian-like.
That being said, whether you've been listening on the earth, above the earth, or below the earth, I'm gonna have to bleep that out. You're supposed to say Sheol.
Sheol. I mouthed and you nodded.
I can't tell what you're mouthing. Anyway, all right. So whether you've been listening below the earth, from the depths of Sheol, we thank you for tuning in on this fine, metaphysical, quantumly transcending, comparative mythology-themed, ancient history episode. And we hope you have a good rest of your night, and that you'll tune in next time where we talk about Santa Claus.